Have you ever wondered why so many stories in the Bible completely ignore African people? Or why it feels like your ancestors' names and wisdom were erased from the pages of history? Today, we're diving deep into a truth that has been hidden for centuries. This isn't just history. It's a spiritual awakening, and it's about reclaiming what has always been yours. Imagine growing up thinking that your heritage had no place in God's story. Painful, right? The truth is, African people have always been central to the Bible. Their wisdom, their spirituality, their connection to the divine. It has never disappeared, even when others tried to hide it. And now, it's time for you to see it, feel it, and embrace it. In this video, we're going to expose the lies and misinterpretations that tried to erase African spiritual contributions. From stories twisted to support power and control, to myths designed to keep people disconnected from their roots. You're going to see how much has been hidden from us. And the best part? You'll also see the unstoppable truth that survived, waiting for you to rediscover it. Your faith doesn't have to make you forget who you are. In fact, the African spiritual heritage inside you is not separate from your Christian identity. It enhances it. Think about the Queen of Sheba testing Solomon's wisdom, or African leaders guiding powerful dreams like Joseph's. These are not minor footnotes. They are central, sacred, and powerful reminders that African spirituality has always been divine and recognized by God. For too long, African spirituality has been labeled as pagan or inferior. But that is a lie. Your ancestors carried wisdom, rituals, and spiritual gifts that were deeply connected to the Creator. These gifts didn't vanish. They survived in songs, prayers, stories, and the quiet knowing of elders. And now, it's your turn to connect with them. So, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or disconnected from your spiritual heritage, this is your moment. As you watch, pay attention to the truths that have been waiting for you. Truths that will awaken your spirit, reconnect you with your ancestors, and make you realize that your faith is richer, fuller, and more powerful than you ever imagined. Get ready to reclaim your spiritual story. Hit that like button if you're ready to uncover hidden truths. Comment below if you've ever felt that your heritage and faith were out of sync. And subscribe, because we're just getting started. This journey is not just about learning history. It's about awakening a powerful, living truth inside you. Africa, often called the cradle of civilization, carries a spiritual legacy that is as ancient as it is profound. Long before the arrival of missionaries and the imposition of foreign religions, African peoples lived in deep connection with the divine, nature, and their ancestors. This was not a fragmented or superficial faith. It was a complete spiritual ecosystem, woven into every aspect of life. From the cycles of the moon to the rhythm of the seasons, from the songs of the elders to the silent prayers of children, spirituality was everywhere. It was not something you attended on a Sunday. It was something you lived, breathed, and embodied in every moment. The African spiritual heritage is rich, vibrant, and multifaceted. Communities understood the interconnectedness of all things: human, animal, earth, sky, and spirit. This understanding was passed down orally, through stories, songs, rituals, and sacred practices, creating a living chain of knowledge. Children were taught to honor the ancestors, respect the environment, and cultivate wisdom that balanced both the visible and invisible worlds. Spirituality was not confined to temples or churches. It existed in the fields, in the rivers, in the homes, and in the hearts of the people. Central to African spirituality was the understanding that every individual carries a spark of the divine. Each person, from birth, was seen as a vessel of spiritual energy, capable of both receiving guidance from ancestors and interpreting signs from the universe. Dreams, visions, and intuitive knowledge were valued as important forms of communication with the divine. Elders acted as spiritual guides, teaching the younger generations how to listen to their inner voice and the wisdom of those who came before. Healing, divination, and rituals were practiced with deep respect and responsibility, forming a sacred bond between the community and the divine order. This heritage also included a profound respect for the sacredness of life and the natural world. Rivers, mountains, trees, and animals were not just resources. They were manifestations of spiritual energy and wisdom. Africans understood the patterns of nature and the cosmos, aligning their spiritual practices with these rhythms. Observing the stars, interpreting the cycles of the moon, and celebrating seasonal changes were all part of a spiritual framework that fostered harmony and balance. This connection created a sense of belonging, purpose, and identity that transcended mere survival. Even when colonization and missionary activities attempted to suppress or erase these practices, the spiritual heritage of Africans survived. It could not be destroyed because it was deeply rooted in the consciousness of the people. Though demonized and labeled as witchcraft or paganism by outsiders, these practices persisted quietly, often hidden in rituals, music, storytelling, and community life. This resilience demonstrates that true spirituality cannot be conquered or silenced. It lives in the hearts and minds of those who carry it. African spirituality also emphasizes the principle of ancestral guidance. Ancestors are seen as active participants in the lives of the living, providing wisdom, protection, and insight. This is not superstition. It is a recognition of continuity, memory, and lineage. The connection to one's ancestors reinforces identity, giving individuals a sense of historical depth and spiritual grounding. For African peoples, to honor the past is to empower the present, creating a bridge between generations that strengthens the community as a whole. What makes this heritage particularly remarkable is its adaptability and openness. Unlike rigid doctrines, African spirituality is flexible, experiential, and deeply personal. It allows individuals to engage with the sacred in ways that resonate with their own hearts and experiences. This is why modern Africans, even in diaspora, can reconnect with their roots and find spiritual empowerment that complements other faiths, including Christianity. It is a heritage that does not require abandoning faith, but enriches it, integrating ancestral wisdom with divine connection. Reclaiming this spiritual heritage today is not just an act of cultural pride. It is an act of liberation. It is a recognition that African peoples were never spiritually deficient, never disconnected from God, and never outsiders in the realm of faith. The sacred knowledge of the ancestors, the rituals of life, the songs of the elders, and the wisdom passed through generations are all alive, waiting to be remembered and celebrated. Each individual who reconnects with this heritage participates in a movement of spiritual awakening, reclaiming the power and truth that colonial history sought to erase. In embracing this spiritual inheritance, Africans today can live with a renewed sense of purpose, freedom, and identity. It is a heritage that teaches resilience, reverence, and responsibility. It empowers the youth to honor their lineage, strengthens communities, and restores a profound sense of belonging in the world. African spiritual heritage is not a relic of the past. It is a living, breathing force, guiding, teaching, and inspiring all who choose to listen. Headline 2. The stories of Africans in the Bible are not just historical footnotes. They are living testaments to a rich spiritual heritage that has often been overlooked. From the wisdom of the Queen of Sheba to the influential role of Joseph in Egypt, African figures were not passive observers but active participants in divine narratives. Their presence is a reminder that Africa was a center of spiritual insight long before colonization attempted to erase its contributions. These figures carried profound understanding, interpreting dreams, recognizing signs and guiding communities with a deep connection to God's will. African wisdom in the Bible is characterized by an intimate relationship with the sacred, an understanding of nature, and a holistic perception of life. These spiritual gifts were never limited to rituals or formal religious practices. They permeated daily life, leadership, and governance. For example, the Queen of Sheba's meeting with Solomon is more than a diplomatic visit. It is a recognition of spiritual intelligence. She questioned, challenged, and illuminated truths that even a famed king admired, showing that African spirituality was not subordinate, but complementary to the wisdom of other cultures. Furthermore, African spiritual practices emphasized balance, connection to ancestors, and attunement to the cycles of nature. These principles often intersected with biblical teachings, revealing that the sacred was not confined to one geography or culture. Understanding African wisdom in the Bible allows modern readers to reclaim a heritage that colonial interpretations attempted to suppress. It invites a perspective where faith is both universal and deeply rooted in African ancestry, where divine insight flows through the veins of those who honor their lineage. This recognition is not just historical, it is transformative, empowering Black communities to embrace their spiritual inheritance with pride and authenticity. Theological weaponization. Against Africans, 350 words. For centuries, religion has been used as a tool of control, and for African peoples, this manipulation was devastating. The Bible, a sacred text meant to guide and inspire, was twisted to justify oppression, slavery, and the erasure of cultural identity. European colonizers and missionaries interpreted scriptures in ways that positioned Africans as inherently inferior, spiritually distant from God, and unworthy of the same divine promises as others. Concepts like cursed Canaan were weaponized to rationalize centuries of subjugation and systemic exclusion. This theological distortion went beyond mere interpretation. It became a method of social engineering. African communities were taught that their own spiritual practices, ancestral wisdom, and connection to the divine were sinful or pagan. Rituals that honored nature, dreams that conveyed spiritual messages, and guidance from elders were condemned as witchcraft. The goal was not only to impose European religious systems but to erase African agency and silence spiritual sovereignty. The impact of this theological weaponization is still felt today. Generations grew up internalizing shame about their skin, culture, and heritage, believing that to be truly spiritual or righteous, they had to abandon their roots. This created a collective trauma, a disconnect between African people and their own historical connection to the sacred. Many were coerced into submission, their voices silenced in churches, and their spiritual expressions limited to forms approved by colonial powers. Yet, this control was never absolute. African spirituality survived underground, in quiet prayers, in songs of resistance, in the hands of healers, and in dreams that carried ancestral guidance. Today, reclaiming these teachings and exposing the ways the Bible was misused is part of a broader movement to restore spiritual dignity. Understanding the weaponization of religion helps African descendants recognize that what was taught as truth was often a tool of domination. By uncovering this history, Africans can reconnect with the divine in ways that honor their ancestry, celebrate their culture, and reject imposed limitations. Theology, once a weapon against them, can now become a pathway to liberation, truth, and spiritual empowerment. African presence in the Bible. 350 words. The African presence in the Bible is far more significant than often acknowledged. From the earliest chapters of Genesis to the later books of the Old and New Testaments, African individuals, leaders, and nations appear as central figures, playing critical roles in the unfolding of God's plan. Yet, over centuries, many of these stories have been misrepresented, minimized, or erased in mainstream teachings, creating a false perception that Africans were peripheral to the biblical narrative. Recognizing African presence in the Bible is not just an academic exercise. It is a reclamation of identity, spiritual heritage, and dignity. Figures such as Cush, Ethiopia, and the Queen of Sheba remind us that Africa was intimately connected to the sacred story. Joseph, taken to Egypt, rose to prominence as a wise interpreter of dreams and a faithful servant of God, showing the spiritual insight and leadership capabilities present in African lands. Likewise, the Ethiopian eunuch in the Book of Acts symbolizes the early integration of Africans into the Christian faith, highlighting that Africans were not outsiders but active participants in God's mission. Understanding this presence reframes how African descendants relate to Scripture. It challenges the historically imposed narratives that suggested Africans were spiritually distant or inferior. Instead, it restores the truth. African bloodlines were interwoven with divine purpose, carrying wisdom, leadership, and faithfulness. This acknowledgement inspires pride, spiritual confidence, and the realization that God's calling and blessings were never racially exclusive. By seeing ourselves in the biblical story, we reconnect with a living spiritual inheritance, one that affirms our place in God's unfolding plan and encourages contemporary believers to embrace both their faith and their African heritage. The wisdom of African ancestors. The wisdom of African ancestors is a living legacy that transcends generations, carrying spiritual knowledge, moral guidance, and practical understanding of the world. Long before written records or formalized education, African communities preserved and transmitted their wisdom orally, through rituals, proverbs, storytelling, and spiritual practices. This knowledge was deeply intertwined with the sacred, linking the seen and unseen, the physical and spiritual realms. Ancestors were not distant figures but active participants in the lives of their descendants, offering guidance, protection, and insight through dreams, signs, and communal teachings. African ancestral wisdom encompasses profound understanding of nature, human behavior, and the cosmos. Elders interpreted celestial events, seasonal changes, and environmental patterns, using these observations to guide agricultural, social, and spiritual life. Proverbs, songs, and myths encoded ethical lessons and communal values, teaching younger generations about justice, courage, compassion, and the interconnectedness of all life. This wisdom was not abstract. It was practical, applicable, and sacred, forming the foundation of personal and societal harmony. Spiritually, African ancestors maintained a direct relationship with the divine, serving as conduits for knowledge and blessings. Rituals, offerings, and ceremonies were performed to honor both the creator and the lineage, acknowledging that life is a continuous exchange between generations. Dreams, visions, and intuitive insights were highly valued, often guiding decisions and revealing hidden truths. This spiritual intelligence was deeply democratic. It belonged to the community and its individuals, not to a privileged few, emphasizing a shared responsibility for sustaining life and faith. Colonization and missionary interventions sought to suppress this ancestral wisdom, labeling it as superstition, witchcraft, or paganism. However, despite these efforts, the essence of African ancestral knowledge survived in hidden forms, through songs, prayers, healing practices, and community rituals. Today, there is a revival of interest in reconnecting with this heritage, recognizing that the wisdom of ancestors provides guidance, identity, and spiritual depth in contemporary life. By honoring and learning from their ancestors, Africans and people of African descent reclaim a part of themselves that colonial narratives tried to erase. This reclamation restores pride, strengthens spiritual connection, and affirms that ancestral wisdom is a vital complement to any religious or philosophical framework. Recognizing the wisdom of African ancestors allows individuals to engage with spirituality and faith on a more profound level. It encourages the integration of historical knowledge with contemporary understanding, fostering a sense of belonging, purpose, and resilience. In essence, ancestral wisdom is not merely a memory of the past. It is a dynamic, living force that continues to shape lives, guide decisions, and inspire spiritual awakening in every generation. Queen of Sheba stands as a timeless emblem of African spiritual intelligence, wisdom, and authority. Her journey to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon was not merely a diplomatic mission, but a profound encounter of minds and spirits. She was not an observer or student. She arrived carrying deep knowledge, discernment, and spiritual insight from her homeland. This African queen represents a tradition where leadership is intertwined with wisdom, intuition, and a direct connection to the divine. The story of the Queen of Sheba challenges the narratives that have historically diminished African contributions to global history and spirituality. Her intelligence, poise, and ability to engage with Solomon reflect a sophisticated understanding of governance, ethics, and divine matters. In her questions and interactions, she demonstrates that African leaders were not only politically astute, but also spiritually perceptive, capable of discerning truth, evaluating moral complexities, and interpreting divine wisdom. Her encounter with Solomon is a powerful illustration of mutual recognition between cultures and spiritual traditions. It highlights the fact that African knowledge and spirituality were never separate from sacred texts or divine truth. Instead, they engaged with and complemented these teachings, showing that African spirituality has always had a rightful place within broader religious and philosophical frameworks. Queen of Sheba symbolizes the depth, resilience, and relevance of African intellectual and spiritual heritage, a reminder that African wisdom has always been present, influential, and transformative. Even today, her story inspires leaders, scholars, and spiritual seekers to embrace the wisdom passed down through generations. It encourages recognition of ancestral knowledge as a guiding force, affirming that African spiritual intelligence is not a relic of the past, but a living, active source of insight, guidance, and empowerment. Her legacy continues to resonate, reminding the world that African heritage carries profound spiritual, intellectual, and cultural significance that deserves honor, study, and celebration. African spiritual practices. Before colonization. Long before colonization, African communities practiced a vibrant, deeply rooted spirituality that guided every aspect of life. Spirituality was not a separate part of existence, but fully integrated into daily living, connecting people to nature, ancestors, and the divine. Rituals, ceremonies, and traditions reflected an understanding that everything, earth, sky, water, and human life, was interwoven in a sacred balance. Africans honored the cycles of nature, celebrated seasonal changes, and held ceremonies that aligned with celestial events, demonstrating a sophisticated awareness of the universe. Ancestral veneration played a central role in spiritual life. Elders, spiritual leaders, and family heads served as mediators between the living and the spiritual world. They guided communities with knowledge passed through generations, using stories, songs, and symbolic acts to teach moral values, preserve history, and interpret signs from the divine. Dreams, visions, and omens were recognized as channels of communication with the spiritual realm, shaping decisions and guiding lives. African spiritual practices also emphasized healing, community, and harmony. Herbal medicine, ritual purification, and prayer were combined to address physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Festivals and communal gatherings reinforced social bonds while honoring both the visible and invisible worlds. These practices nurtured resilience, identity, and belonging, fostering a deep sense of interconnectedness between individuals, their environment, and the divine. Colonization sought to suppress these practices, labeling them as pagan or inferior, yet their essence survived. Hidden rituals, oral traditions, and subtle expressions of faith persisted, ensuring that African spiritual heritage remained alive. Recognizing these practices today is an act of reclaiming history and honoring the wisdom of ancestors who lived in harmony with the sacred. The richness, complexity, and depth of African spirituality before colonization remind us that these traditions are not relics, but living systems of knowledge, guiding present and future generations toward understanding, balance, and divine connection. Surviving African spiritual gifts. Despite suppression, African spiritual gifts have endured through centuries of colonization, slavery, and systemic attempts to erase indigenous practices. Despite the imposition of foreign religious doctrines and the labeling of ancestral knowledge as witchcraft or pagan, these gifts have never disappeared. They survived quietly, woven into the daily lives of families, whispered in prayers, remembered in stories, and expressed through music, dance, and healing practices. These spiritual gifts include intuitive insight, dream interpretation, herbal healing, connection with ancestral spirits, and the ability to sense unseen forces in nature. Even when formal religious structures sought to suppress them, African communities nurtured these abilities in private, ensuring that the sacred knowledge continued to thrive. Elders became the keepers of this wisdom, passing it down subtly through oral traditions, rituals, and guidance, often hidden from the eyes of colonizers and outsiders. The resilience of African spiritual gifts demonstrates the unbreakable bond between people and their sacred inheritance. Dreams that foretold events, visions that guided decisions, and prayers that brought comfort or healing were all acts of spiritual continuity. Even in urban environments far removed from ancestral lands, these gifts manifested in practices that adapted to the new circumstances, showing remarkable flexibility and endurance. Today, reconnecting with these spiritual gifts is an act of revival and reclaiming identity. Africans, and people of African descent, are rediscovering their inherent abilities to communicate with the divine, interpret signs, and harness their spiritual sensitivity. These gifts are no longer seen as threats or anomalies, but as powerful tools for personal growth, community building, and spiritual freedom. The survival of African spiritual gifts is a testament to the strength, wisdom, and resilience of the people who carried them through generations. Despite oppression, these gifts remain alive, waiting to be acknowledged, practiced, and celebrated once again. Recognizing and embracing them today is both an honoring of ancestors and a step toward reclaiming a spiritual identity that colonization sought to erase, but could never destroy. Reconciling African identity with Christian faith. Reconciling African identity with Christian faith is not about choosing one over the other. It is about understanding that both can coexist harmoniously. For centuries, African spirituality was misrepresented, suppressed, or erased under colonial and religious systems that sought to control every aspect of life. Yet, beneath this suppression, the spiritual heritage of African people remained alive, resilient, and quietly vibrant. Today, many are discovering that embracing Christianity does not require abandoning the rich traditions and ancestral wisdom that have shaped African communities for millennia. African identity carries within it stories, rituals, and values that are deeply connected to the divine. From the rhythms of ancestral dances to the teachings passed down by elders, these practices are expressions of faith in the sacred order of life. When Africans approach Christianity from this perspective, they begin to see that the essence of faith, love, justice, wisdom, and connection to the divine, is already present within their own heritage. Rather than conflicting, African spirituality and Christian teachings can enrich each other, creating a faith that is holistic, grounded, and deeply personal. This reconciliation also means confronting and dismantling the narratives that portrayed African cultural practices as incompatible with Christian belief. It requires courage to reject centuries of imposed shame, and to recognize that God's love is not limited by skin color, history, or cultural expression. Many who undertake this journey find freedom in worshiping with their own rhythms, celebrating ancestral symbols alongside biblical teachings, and integrating prayers, songs, and rituals that honor both traditions. Ultimately, reconciling African identity with Christian faith is about reclaiming the full story of spiritual inheritance. It is about teaching young Africans that their roots are not a burden, but a source of divine connection. It is about affirming that one can be fully African and fully Christian, carrying forward a faith that honors both the ancestors and the Creator. By embracing this integration, communities can cultivate a spirituality that is authentic, liberating, and reflective of the true depth of African heritage. Freedom to pray and worship in your own rhythm. In a world where religious practices have often been rigidly defined, Africans and people of African descent have long carried a rhythm in their spirituality that is uniquely their own. This rhythm is not just a pattern of music or dance. It is the heartbeat of a people whose connection to the divine transcends conventional forms. For centuries, colonial powers attempted to impose a uniform mode of worship, stripping away ancestral practices and silencing expressions that did not fit their narrow definitions of faith. Yet, the spiritual pulse of African communities persisted. It survived in the quiet moments of dawn prayers, in songs passed down through generations, in the clapping of hands and the stomping of feet that invoked the presence of the sacred, and in rituals that honored both the ancestors and God. Freedom in worship is about reclaiming this space, allowing the spiritual identity of African people to flourish without compromise. To pray in your own rhythm is to embrace a spirituality that reflects your ancestry, your history, and your personal connection with the divine. It is a liberation from the idea that faith must conform to prescribed molds, and an affirmation that God is present in every authentic expression of devotion. When Africans rediscover this freedom, worship becomes an immersive, holistic experience. It involves the body, the voice, and the soul. Dancing while praising, chanting while invoking the divine, or meditating quietly in solitude. All are valid and sacred acts. This approach reconnects individuals with the innate spirituality that was suppressed, yet never extinguished, revealing that worship is not about performing rituals correctly, but about expressing the sincerity and depth of one's relationship with God. By embracing this freedom, communities also foster intergenerational spiritual wisdom. Elders teach younger members not only through scriptures but through lived experiences, through songs, stories, and the natural rhythms of life. These practices cultivate a vibrant, dynamic faith, proving that spirituality cannot be constrained by uniformity. True freedom in worship affirms that African heritage and Christian faith are not contradictory, but complementary. One's ancestry can harmoniously coexist with devotion to God, enriching the spiritual journey and allowing worship to resonate deeply with the soul. The younger generation of Africans today is experiencing a profound awakening, one that reconnects them with the deep spiritual roots of their ancestry. Amid the fast-paced modern world, many young Africans feel a void, a sense that something essential has been lost over generations. This rediscovery is more than curiosity. It is a reclaiming of identity, culture, and sacred wisdom that colonial and missionary systems once tried to suppress. They are exploring the traditions, rituals, and stories passed down from elders, recognizing that these are not mere folklore but living teachings that contain guidance, resilience, and a connection to the divine. Through music, dance, storytelling, and community gatherings, African youth are beginning to engage with the spiritual practices of their ancestors in ways that feel authentic and empowering. They are learning to see their heritage not as a relic of the past, but as a source of strength, creativity, and spiritual insight. This reconnection also involves understanding the historical distortions imposed by colonial powers and religious institutions, which often attempted to erase African contributions to faith, knowledge, and culture. By reclaiming these truths, youth are fostering a sense of pride and belonging, realizing that their identity and spirituality are inseparable. Many are also turning to the natural world, rituals, and ancestral guidance as avenues to explore their inner selves and cultivate spiritual awareness. Dreams, visions, and meditation become tools to hear the wisdom of those who came before. By honoring these practices, young Africans are building bridges between past and present, ensuring that spiritual traditions continue to live and evolve. This awakening is not limited to individual exploration. It is collective. Youth are creating communities, online platforms, and local circles where knowledge is shared and cultural expression is celebrated. They are redefining what it means to be African and spiritual in today's world, embracing a holistic identity that honors both the richness of heritage and the freedom to express faith authentically. In reconnecting with their ancestry, African youth are not only healing personal and collective wounds, but are also igniting a spiritual renaissance that promises to inspire generations to come. Faith beyond race. Understanding God's intention. Faith is meant to transcend boundaries, yet throughout history, race has often been used as a dividing line within religious teachings. For Africans and people of African descent, much of their spiritual expression was misrepresented or suppressed to fit colonial and westernized frameworks. Today, there is a powerful shift taking place. The understanding that God's intention has never been limited by color, ethnicity, or origin. Faith is not about conforming to restrictive human constructs, but about embracing a divine connection that is universal, inclusive, and deeply personal. This realization allows believers to step beyond the limitations imposed by distorted interpretations of Scripture and embrace a faith that acknowledges the spiritual significance of every individual. African people are learning that their identity, culture, and ancestry are not obstacles to spiritual fulfillment, but essential components of it. God's intention has always been to honor diversity, to celebrate the richness of creation, and to empower every community to connect with the divine in its unique way. Understanding faith beyond race also invites reflection on historical misrepresentations. Scriptures were often manipulated to justify racial hierarchies and exclusion. But the truth is that Africans and people of all backgrounds were always included in God's plan. Recognizing this helps dismantle internalized doubts and shame, fostering a spiritual confidence that aligns with both heritage and belief. By embracing this inclusive understanding, believers can cultivate a faith that is authentic, resilient, and liberating. They can engage in prayer, worship, and spiritual practice without fear of judgment or erasure, knowing that God's love and intention are expansive. Faith beyond race empowers individuals to honor their ancestry, celebrate their gifts, and engage fully in a spiritual journey that uplifts both themselves and their communities. It's a return to the core of divine purpose, unity, justice, and the acknowledgement that every soul has value, dignity, and a sacred place in the unfolding story of God's creation. For centuries, African spiritual traditions were systematically erased, suppressed, and replaced with foreign religious narratives. Colonizers, missionaries, and dominant religious institutions sought to delegitimize African spiritual wisdom, labeling it as paganism or witchcraft. This erasure was not accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to weaken African identity, control communities, and disconnect people from their ancestral roots. Yet, despite centuries of suppression, African spiritual memory and practice never fully disappeared. They survived in whispers, rituals, songs, and communal traditions, passed down quietly from generation to generation. Resisting religious erasure is a conscious, courageous act. It begins with acknowledging that African spirituality is valid, sacred, and inseparable from history. It involves reclaiming stories, rituals, and symbols that were once dismissed or distorted. By doing so, Africans and people of African descent can assert that their spiritual heritage is alive, relevant, and uncolonizable. This resistance also means questioning doctrines or teachings that were historically manipulated to justify racial hierarchy or marginalize African contributions to faith. The process of resisting erasure is both personal and collective. On a personal level, it is reconnecting with ancestral knowledge, honoring the spiritual practices of elders, and embracing one's cultural identity as part of faith. On a communal level, it involves education, dialogue, and creating spaces where African spiritual wisdom is celebrated, preserved, and integrated with modern religious practice. This resistance transforms not only spiritual understanding, but also social and cultural empowerment, enabling communities to reclaim dignity and agency that colonial systems sought to strip away. Ultimately, resisting religious erasure is a journey of liberation. It is about refusing to let imposed narratives define one's relationship with the sacred. It is about healing from historical trauma, recognizing the continuity of African spiritual presence, and asserting the right to worship, pray, and connect with God in ways that honor both faith and ancestry. By standing against erasure, Africans are not only preserving their past, they are shaping a future where spiritual identity and heritage coexist in harmony, free from distortion and suppression. Throughout African spiritual traditions, dreams and spiritual signs have always held profound significance. They are considered bridges between the physical world and the spiritual realm, providing guidance, warnings, and revelations from ancestors or the divine. Unlike the Western tendency to dismiss dreams as mere imagination, African spirituality treats them as vital messages that inform decisions, reveal truths, and shape destinies. From children experiencing prophetic dreams to elders interpreting visions, this knowledge has been passed quietly through generations, preserving a deep connection to the unseen. Dreams often communicate in symbolic language. Animals, colors, natural phenomena, or recurring patterns are interpreted as messages that carry spiritual meaning. These signs are not random. They are carefully observed and understood within the cultural and spiritual context of the community. In many cases, dreams serve as early warnings of danger, revelations of hidden truths, or insights into personal and communal challenges. Spiritual signs, on the other hand, may appear as coincidences, repeated events, or natural phenomena that hold symbolic significance. Recognizing these signs requires attentiveness, spiritual discipline, and trust in one's ancestral guidance. During colonization, the importance of dreams and spiritual signs was often dismissed or condemned as superstition. Missionaries and religious authorities sought to replace these practices with rigid doctrinal teachings, framing African spiritual knowledge as inferior or even sinful. Yet, despite centuries of suppression, this spiritual wisdom survived. Elders continued to interpret dreams for their families, communities continued to honor omens, and individuals quietly followed spiritual prompts in their daily lives. This resilience ensured that African spiritual practices remained alive, even under the pressures of forced religious conformity. Today, reconnecting with the power of dreams and spiritual signs allows African descendants to reclaim a vital aspect of their spiritual identity. Paying attention to dreams, learning the symbolism, and trusting intuitive messages strengthens the bond with ancestry and deepens the connection to God. It teaches that spirituality is alive, interactive, and profoundly personal. Recognizing these gifts is a form of resistance, affirmation, and empowerment, allowing individuals to navigate life with clarity, wisdom, and divine insight. In African traditions, spiritual guidance is not only an individual experience but also a communal one. Families, elders, and community leaders serve as channels for ancestral wisdom, offering direction, protection, and insight. From a young age, children are taught to observe, listen, and respect the subtle spiritual cues in daily life. A grandmother's gentle advice, a father's ritual blessing, or a community ceremony can all convey guidance that connects the living to generations past. This guidance is a vital part of sustaining identity, culture, and faith. Elders play a particularly important role. Their knowledge of rituals, ancestral stories, and spiritual practices provides a framework for interpreting life's challenges. When a community member faces illness, conflict, or uncertainty, elders often mediate through prayer, dreams, or symbolic actions, pointing the way toward resolution. This guidance is not authoritarian. It empowers individuals to make choices while staying rooted in spiritual awareness. Children learn to discern between wisdom and mere opinion, cultivating intuition alongside communal teachings. Families also act as the first line of spiritual education. Daily prayers, songs, rituals, and even storytelling are infused with spiritual meaning. Children are encouraged to notice patterns, recognize signs, and respect the unseen forces influencing their lives. Through these practices, they internalize a sense of belonging, purpose, and responsibility to their ancestors and community. Spiritual guidance becomes a shared language, weaving together generations and creating resilience against external pressures or spiritual erasure. Colonialism and forced religious conformity often sought to break these bonds, labeling African spiritual practices as primitive or invalid. Yet, these traditions persisted quietly. Elders maintained secret knowledge, families preserved rituals at home, and community gatherings continued to honor spiritual guidance in culturally significant ways. Today, reconnecting with these practices allows African descendants to reclaim a vital part of their heritage. Recognizing spiritual guidance in family and community not only strengthens faith, but also restores the continuity of ancestral wisdom. It teaches that spirituality is collective, lived and nurtured across generations, providing insight, grounding, and a sense of sacred belonging. Returning to scriptures with a new perspective. Returning to the scriptures with a fresh, culturally conscious perspective is a transformative journey for Africans and people of African descent. For centuries, the interpretation of sacred texts was filtered through colonial and Eurocentric lenses that often minimized or erased African contributions and presence. This has led many to feel disconnected from the faith, as though their ancestry and spiritual heritage were incompatible with the Bible. However, when approached with intentionality and openness, the scriptures reveal a depth of African presence, wisdom, and divine connection that has always been there, waiting to be recognized. A new perspective begins with reclaiming the narrative. It involves reading the Bible not merely as a foreign text imposed upon African communities, but as a living document that intersects with ancestral knowledge. Recognizing figures of African origin and influence, understanding the symbolic language within the context of African spirituality, and acknowledging the shared values of justice, community, and divine relationship enables readers to re-establish a sense of belonging. This approach transforms the act of reading from passive consumption to active dialogue, where the African reader sees themselves reflected in the sacred stories and moral principles. This shift also requires challenging prior misinterpretations that were used as tools of control. Texts once employed to justify subjugation or spiritual inferiority can now be revisited to uncover empowerment, resilience, and divine favor. For instance, understanding the cultural and historical context behind biblical laws, parables, and prophecies allows African readers to reclaim agency, seeing their ancestors not as passive recipients, but as active participants in God's plan. Engaging with Scripture from this perspective nurtures a faith that is simultaneously authentic and liberating. It allows individuals to integrate their African identity with their spiritual practice, without compromise, embracing rituals, symbolism, and ancestral wisdom alongside biblical teachings. The act of reading becomes a reconciling force, bridging the gap between historical trauma and contemporary spiritual empowerment. Ultimately, returning to scriptures with a new perspective is a form of spiritual justice. It restores what was hidden or marginalized, honoring the divine imprint within African heritage. It invites believers to read the texts with curiosity, courage, and reverence, seeing the African narrative interwoven with the universal story of God's people. By reclaiming this perspective, faith is not only preserved but enriched, offering a holistic understanding of God's intention that celebrates both African identity and spiritual devotion. The role of ancestry in spiritual identity. Ancestry is the heartbeat of spiritual identity, carrying the wisdom, rituals, and divine connections of generations before us. For Africans and people of African descent, reconnecting with one's lineage is not merely a cultural exercise but a spiritual awakening. Our ancestors were conduits of sacred knowledge, mediators between the earthly and the divine, and guardians of spiritual truths that colonial narratives sought to suppress. Understanding this role of ancestry transforms one's faith, grounding it in a lived, vibrant heritage that transcends mere religious doctrine. Spiritual identity is inseparable from ancestry because it provides a lens through which one can interpret experiences, symbols, and divine interactions. The prayers whispered by grandmothers, the rhythms of ceremonial drums, and the knowledge of herbs and healing were all carriers of spiritual authority passed down through generations. These ancestral imprints guide contemporary spiritual practices, allowing individuals to connect with the divine in ways that are authentic and deeply personal. Recognizing one's ancestors as spiritual guides fosters a sense of belonging, resilience, and purpose. Colonialism and religious indoctrination attempted to sever this connection, labeling ancestral practices as pagan or heretical. Yet, the resilience of these spiritual traditions reveals that ancestry cannot be erased. Even in silence, through subtle teachings, dreams, and rituals, ancestral wisdom survived. Modern spiritual seekers are now rediscovering these legacies, understanding that true faith incorporates both the sacred teachings of Scripture and the ancestral knowledge inherent in one's lineage. Acknowledging ancestry also empowers communities. It restores collective memory, allowing entire groups to reclaim rituals, ceremonies, and spiritual practices that nurture unity and continuity. This reclamation is an act of spiritual justice, honoring those who came before while creating a foundation for future generations. By integrating ancestral guidance into personal faith, individuals develop a holistic spirituality that validates their African identity while deepening their relationship with the divine. Ultimately, the role of ancestry in spiritual identity is a call to remember, honor, and engage with the wisdom of those who preceded us. It is a reminder that spiritual depth is not inherited from books or imposed doctrines alone, but lived and experienced through the continuum of generations. Embracing ancestry as central to spiritual identity bridges past and present, grounding faith in history, community, and divine connection. Through this integration, one finds empowerment, clarity, and a profound sense of belonging, understanding that the spiritual gifts and knowledge of ancestors are not relics of the past. They are living forces, guiding the faithful today, breaking the chains of theological indoctrination. For centuries, African spiritual identity has been systematically undermined through religious teachings designed to control and suppress. Theologies were crafted not only to convert but to dominate, stripping away ancestral knowledge, sacred practices, and the inherent spiritual authority of African peoples. This indoctrination worked subtly, embedding the idea that African customs, rituals, and beliefs were inferior or even sinful. Many were led to believe that salvation demanded abandoning culture, history, and spiritual inheritance. Yet, Breaking these chains begins with awareness. Recognizing that much of what was taught was manipulated to enforce power over African communities is the first step toward liberation. Understanding the historical context of religious indoctrination reveals how interpretation of Scripture was often distorted to justify slavery, colonization, and racial hierarchy. Concepts like divine punishment, inferiority, or exclusion were not universal spiritual truths, but instruments of control. Once this awareness takes root, the path toward reclaiming spiritual autonomy opens. Africans can revisit religious texts with discernment, separating the core divine teachings from human-imposed distortions. Spiritual practices that were once labeled as pagan can now be celebrated as authentic expressions of connection with God and the universe. Individuals begin to see that their spirituality is not invalidated by religious history. It is enhanced by the richness of their ancestral heritage. Breaking these chains also means resisting internalized shame. Many generations were taught to feel unworthy or disconnected from God because of their identity. Undoing this programming requires courage, reflection, and the willingness to embrace spiritual truth as it aligns. For centuries, African communities have faced the erasure of their spiritual practices, wisdom, and sacred knowledge. Colonization, slavery, and the manipulation of religious texts contributed to a spiritual injustice that denied Africans the recognition of their divine heritage. Restoring African spiritual justice is not only about reclaiming history, it is about honoring the inherent sacredness of African identity and reconnecting with ancestral knowledge that has always been alive, even under suppression. This restoration begins with acknowledgement. Understanding that spiritual suppression was intentional allows communities to see the depth of what was taken from them and why. It highlights the resilience of African spirituality, which survived despite centuries of marginalization. From hidden rituals to oral traditions, the wisdom of ancestors endured, waiting for a time when it could re-emerge fully. Restoring spiritual justice also involves active reclamation. This can be done through education, communal rituals, and embracing practices that honor the connection between the divine, nature, and ancestry. Africans are learning to reintroduce sacred rhythms, songs, prayers, and symbols that were once forbidden or labeled as pagan. By reclaiming these practices, they assert that their spirituality is valid, sacred, and undiminished by external attempts to control or distort it. Moreover, spiritual justice means creating space for recognition and equality within contemporary religious frameworks. African faith traditions are not inferior to westernized interpretations. They are complementary, offering depth, insight, and a direct connection to the divine. Youth and communities are rediscovering that faith does not require the erasure of identity. Instead, it can be a bridge that unites African heritage with universal spiritual truths. Restoration is also communal. Elders, spiritual leaders, and youth collaborate to revive and transmit ancestral knowledge, ensuring that future generations inherit a legacy of empowerment rather than shame. This collective reclamation transforms not only individual faith, but also the spiritual landscape of African communities worldwide. In essence, restoring African spiritual justice is an act of liberation, dignity, and reverence. It acknowledges past wrongs while actively cultivating a future where African spirituality is celebrated, practiced, and respected. This justice allows individuals to reclaim, living a Christian faith, while embracing African roots, is both possible and profoundly transformative. For generations, African spirituality and Christian teachings were wrongly portrayed as opposing forces. Colonization and missionary narratives often suggested that to follow Christ, one had to abandon ancestral wisdom, cultural practices, and even the rhythms of African life. Yet, this is far from the truth. Christianity does not demand the erasure of heritage. On the contrary, Faith flourishes when it recognizes and honors the depth of one's identity. African heritage carries timeless spiritual knowledge. The songs, prayers, rituals, and ancestral guidance passed down through generations reflect a direct connection to the divine. These practices were never meant to conflict with God, but to guide communities in harmony, morality, and spiritual awareness. Even under suppression, African spiritual gifts persisted quietly, sustaining families and communities. Recognizing this truth allows believers to approach God with freedom, authenticity, and a sense of belonging. Reconciling African identity with Christian faith involves celebrating both without compromise. It means honoring ancestors while worshiping God, integrating cultural rhythms into prayer, and embracing spiritual gifts inherited through lineage. It is about reading scriptures with fresh eyes, understanding that God's presence transcends race, and acknowledging that faith is not limited to Western interpretations. This reconciliation nurtures a richer, fuller spirituality, where worship becomes a holistic experience encompassing body, mind, and soul. By embracing both Christianity and African heritage, individuals reclaim their spiritual agency. Faith becomes vibrant, alive, and deeply personal. It inspires confidence, fosters community, and empowers believers to live authentically without guilt or fear. Celebrating African roots while following Christ affirms that divine love is inclusive, transcending boundaries imposed by history. This harmonious integration allows African Christians to experience worship that resonates with their true identity, enriching their spiritual journey and strengthening the connection to God, ancestors, and community. Faith need not demand separation from heritage. Instead, it flourishes when African identity and Christian devotion walk hand in hand, creating a spiritual path that is authentic, empowering, and deeply liberating. As we reach the culmination of this journey through African spiritual heritage and Christian faith, it becomes clear that reclaiming our roots is not just an act of remembrance. It is an act of liberation. The wisdom, gifts, and practices passed down through generations have always been alive within us, quietly waiting for the moment we would reconnect with them. By embracing our ancestry and honoring the spiritual intelligence embedded in our culture, we realize that faith is not a limitation, but a bridge that allows us to walk fully in both worlds. This journey challenges us to break free from the imposed silences, to question distorted narratives, and to recognize that what was once suppressed can now flourish with power and authenticity. Every prayer, every act of worship, every reflection on Scripture becomes richer and more profound when it acknowledges the depth of our heritage. The call now is not merely to observe, but to actively participate in restoring this spiritual legacy, not as an abstraction but as a living, breathing reality in our daily lives. Each one of us carries the responsibility to pass this knowledge, wisdom, and freedom forward, empowering the next generation to walk in confidence and spiritual sovereignty. Let this reflection inspire you to honor your roots, to reclaim the fullness of your faith, and to live boldly in alignment with both your African identity and your Christian conviction. Your story, your ancestry, and your spiritual gifts are not separate. They are inseparable threads in the fabric of divine purpose. Rise, reconnect, and let your light shine unapologetically, showing the world that embracing your origins only strengthens your walk with the Creator.